Hello everyone, welcome back to God Loves Gays. I forgot my title for a minute. It is going to be a busy week for me. My family is packing up, my brother is moving out into their own place, and we are going to be doing a lot of packing and moving and stuff. So I am exhausted already, but couldn't miss the next episode of God Loves Gays, which is on the wrong slide. Gosh darn it. Let's fix that. Wow, it was all the way at the end. My bad. You're getting a preview. Alright. Today, we are talking about some ancient history. Very broad strokes of history. Trying to cover a couple 100 years without going into too much detail, because what we really want to get to is later on. But we got stuff we got to talk about first. We were, in our timeline, around the point where Constantine converted to Christianity, the Emperor of Rome, of the Roman Empire. He is converted, and so now that's the official religion of the Empire. It doesn't happen in a day, but he brings everybody under the Christian banner. His son comes next and tries to switch it back, and it does not work. Christianity is the emperor's religion and the empire's religion. That is going to lead to some pretty big changes as far as the development of Christianity goes. Until this point, we talked about how it was just a bunch of different groups that each had their own ideas. And none of the groups really had any more strength in the background. There's a fan in the background? Yeah, that's the ceiling fan. I think my family is having the air go very, very strongly. Why don't I see if I can close the vent and if that will help? One moment. Oy. Entertain them, Bob. There we go. That is much better. The vent was shut, so that's what you were hearing. Okay, what was I saying? The Empire. So, until this point, it was all a bunch of cliques doing their own thing. You had a bunch of people in charge who were writing letters, making their arguments about who was right about Jesus, what should be the way that we see Jesus, but nobody really had the power and influence to force people to change their mind and change what they did at church. Constantine did. He changed the rules, changed the laws, to reinforce his idea of Christianity. Heretical groups were taxed heavier. Non-heretical groups got tax breaks. Mass conversion to Christianity was huge. It went to like 30 million people within a couple years. It became the done thing. Until this point, Christianity was a very diverse group of a lot of mostly poor people, lower class people from a variety of walks of life. And now it is in vogue to convert. It can actually get you power at court, influence at court. That had never been a thing before. The idea that Christianity could be used as a tool... Thought I turned you off. Christianity could be used as a tool to move up in the world, which is going to attract some less stellar people to Christianity, specifically people in power. By the 430s, which is like 100 years after Constantine converted, I think it was 336. By then, most city-dwelling, educated Romans were Christian. Most of them. Some people, there were still, people that would die still being pagan. But new pagans really were not coming along, The masses converted way faster than the upper class, of course, because it was a religion that really appealed to them. And there were eventually some issues where there were riots, Christians attacking pagan temples, things like that. By the end of the 5th century, there really were no more pagans. There were mostly Christians, heretical Christians, Jewish people, and very, very small group of people that would be considered pagan, but they were not really an organized religion anymore. As far as Roman culture, it doesn't change a lot with the advent of Christianity. Roman works of art and literature are still taught. All the ancient teachers are still valued. They fuse the two together so that old Roman ways of life really don't go away, which is part of what helped with switching the culture over to Christianity, because Christianity wasn't trying to erase all of the other things that made it Roman. It was basically just changing who you were worshiping while you were also still going to your baths and watching your plays and reading your books by Plato. It wasn't trying to completely rebuild the culture from the ground up. The Council of Nicaea was basically an attempt to get Christians on the same page because Christians were starting to fight other Christians. Yes, it was! I don't want to make it sound like Constantine rolled in and everything, changed overnight. What changed was the fact that there was a person in power who could reinforce ideas of correctness. Where in the past, the Christian church didn't have that overall hierarchy that Roman politics does. So, he could basically take all the bishops, throw them in a room, which is kind of what he did, and he said, fix it, solve it. He didn't really care what they decided, but they had to make a decision. And so there was a couple of these different creeds that happened over the time when he was organizing Christianity, and by the 500s, we basically see Christian doctrine, as we imagine it today, kind of solidifying because of these centuries of kind of arguing and bickering where, in the past, the arguing and bickering had gone on for 300 years and not changed because nobody had the power to kind of force them to put an end to it. Constantine taking over, making it the state religion, allowed for that system, that hierarchy to take over. So now we're seeing the Christian church forming into a power structure that it was not anymore. Or that it was not before. Gregory the Great is going to be another major political influence. Specifically, what we want to talk about with him is how he didn't really change much as far as becoming a Christian. Hello, Pablo. Welcome. Now, Christianity is the religion of the empire. Christianity is the religion that everybody should convert to. But what does that mean for people living their daily lives? You know, they've had these traditions and these things they've done their whole lives. Well, basically, Gregory the Great said, get baptized, you're a Christian. You don't have to change your traditions, your folklore, your stories. You don't have to change all that. In fact, you could continue to worship at the same places you'd always worshipped so long as you sprinkled them with holy water. At this point, the pagans that remained were on the fringes of the empire. You will, of course, see the accusations that, you know, as they have these various groups that fight them on the edges of the empire, there will always be those people that are like, yes, it is the Vikings who are the homos, bringing their terrible homoness down here. It's always someone over there. But really, Christianity taking over did not change a lot of people's daily lives. It did not change where they worshipped. It didn't change how they worshipped. It didn't change the laws that much. It was basically same old, except we've switched Zeus out for Jesus. You know, there are changes. The ideas about marriage started to change, where you see marriage. Aw, thank you, Pablo. That's very kind of you. You see marriage cease to be a business transaction so much. I mean, you're still going to see that over the centuries, but it starts to be seen as a loving relationship. It is a bond between people. The kind of more modern ideas we have of marriage start to come out around this period. Can I do a series on the books that are considered non-canonical? That would be fun. We might do that. See, I'm trying to get through our timeline so that we can, have a general idea of Christian history, and then maybe we'll just dive into some biblical texts. We gotta talk about Sodom and Gomorrah at some point. And then also it would be fun to talk about some other apocrypha. We discussed, I think I read some in a few previous episodes, so there are some discussions, but we will probably dive more into things. There's no support from the Bible for gay marriage, but constantly citing the verses about homosexuality is always out of context. I agree. I agree in that there's condemnation in the Bible for certain kinds of homosexuality, which we've discussed why those condemnations are vague and hard to understand outside of cultural context, but it doesn't condemn gay marriage necessarily, which we'll kind of get to. It's weird. Paul does, but again, Paul and I have trouble. There's reasons to be conflicted about how Paul is portrayed, because we're still figuring out Paul's letters. Half of them weren't written by Paul, but we talked about that. I think personally, I would take any pieces of the Bible that are not divine revelation. As a believer, I would take those with a grain of salt, and to me that is Paul. Paul is just a follower who liked Jesus. He was not Jesus. He does not get final say. Anyway, talking about Rome. So what you're going to see at this point, you will see Christianity taking on a more centralized power structure. It now has influence throughout the empire. Every town has got basically a bishop that's in charge of the church, and it's got this structure, and we're seeing Roman Catholicism take root. But it doesn't necessarily have the same influence that it will in the future. Like, what we imagine them having today, or really like 300, 400 years ago, doesn't quite exist yet. Because, I gotta answer this because they aren't at the house. Hey, I'm streaming. Is something up?
Yeah,
No, what's up?
I was going to come down and get your bookends and the cans on the screen.
Oh, I'll get them as soon as we're done. Bye. Okay. At this point, the Christian church has a lot of communal influence in that, it is a major part of every town and city, especially, outside in the country, maybe not as much, but it doesn't have a lot of political or social power yet. Sure, at court, it's good to be a Christian. It's going to get you some influence. But at this point, marriage is not a sacrament. It's not a major part of the church. You don't even have to go to a church to get married. At this point in history, marriage is two people coming together and signing a document and being like, yay! For the most part, people would follow their own ancient traditions and customs. Local customs took over for, how people got married, funerals. Like, Christianity was a major part of their faith, the God that they worshipped, but the traditions were from the older times. Just things that they, like Christianity didn't come in and replace those things. So they just continued to trudge along. We will see ancient marriages, and we will discuss some in a moment, that involve women and men. We talked about in previous episodes, Egypt had a lot of, history of female marriages. Well, at this point in the Roman Empire, that's going to continue. Just because the Roman Empire is Christian now, they don't stop getting married. Because at this point, until the 1200s, some like 800 years later, the church will not take over marriage. It won't take control of it until then. That is when you're going to see a major shift in how Christianity functions in society, which we will talk about. Now, in 438, we did have a Roman emperor who created a law specifying men who are used as a woman's body will be burned at the stake. But this, again, isn't really a Christian thing. More so, that kind of comes from the ancient Roman idea we talked about, where the penetrated person is seen as lesser, and that it is not socially acceptable for men to enjoy that. And that it feels very much like a step towards that kind of idea. But it is an ancient version of some of the laws we will see 1,000 years later. In 533, Justinian I, one of the emperors, mentions, he blames men who lust after other men for natural disasters, and orders castration as a punishment for sodomy. In the 700s, we see these things called the penitentials, which are pamphlets that were written for priests as like a guide. At this point, confession is a normal, like a big thing in the church now, and so the pamphlets were written to help priests with understanding how to deal with confessions and what to say. And one of the things listed as a sin that was discussed is homosexuality. At this point, it was treated similarly to heterosexual adultery. So this is like a thing that your priest would have talked over with you to try and lead you back to the path. This is not something where the priest would have turned you into the law. In 829, that's the Synod of Paris, which I think was I can't remember what it was, but it was one of those mentions where they talk about Hungarian invasions from the barbarians, the Moors, the Viking raids. They blame those on sex, same-sex eroticism, and paganism. Of course, always the same things. Then we will get to the Byzantine Empire, something we have to talk about, where the Roman Empire is not going to be a unit forever. Now, at different points in history, it's still kind of one empire, just with two courts. It's not going to be something we talk about today because it gets complicated, but the splitting of the empire is going to lead into two different versions of Christianity: Catholic, why did I say that weird? Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox. We're mostly sticking with the Catholic at this point in time. But while these various kind of rules sort of, sound bad, again, remember how hard it was to prove sex crimes in the old world, and the fact that they were very, very rarely enacted, and a same-sex partnership was not the same as proof of the kind of sodomy crimes that would have been punished at certain points in history. And up until, as we've said, the 1200 era, there really wasn't a lot of church influence politically on laws about sex and about what to do with that's going to change in a major way, but at this point it really wasn't a thing. And in fact, as monasteries and as female monasteries, I don't remember the nunneries, as they start to come around in this era and become a major thing, same-sex activities at these places become huge. We have a lot of letters condemning this, specifically because these are people that are supposed to be chaste in general. But, there was a guy that wrote a letter that was like, all of the nuns shall sleep with a lamp, so that we may see that no one is being rude in the night. You must keep a lamp on at all times, and everyone should have their own bunk. It was very much an issue, but it wouldn't be dealt with until the 1200s because, again, they're going to pass some rules that make it much stricter to enter the nunnery, to, much stricter punishments for these kinds of things. It's going to change a lot. There's a lot of reasons for why things are going to get pretty shitty. But until this point, it wasn't that terrible back in this period. Pagan traditions were kind of just trudging along alongside Christianity, just kind of in a different banner. People were still, following their old folk traditions. They were getting married in the old ways that they did, following these old traditions while just worshiping a different god. Let's look at this is Same-Sex Unions in Pre-Modern Europe. Fascinating book, but incredibly hard to read. This is this is what I guess the priest or the officiant would read during a marriage. This is from the 10th century, originally was in Greek, and it is for a same-sex couple. O Lord our God, who made humankind in thine image and likeness, and gave it power over all flesh everlasting, and who now hast approved thy saints and apostles, Philip and Bartholomew, becoming partners, not bound together by nature, but in the unity of the Holy Spirit, and in the mode of faith, thou who didst consider thy servants and martyrs, Sergei and Bacchus, worthy to be united, bless thy servants, joined not by nature, but grant them to love each other and to remain unhated and without scandal all the days of their lives, with the help of the Holy Mother of God and ever Virgin Mary, because to thee belongs all glory, honor, and worship. Oh, is somebody being shitty? Feel free to block, folks. I trust you, Jeff. I trust your judgment. Always. Isn't that lovely? There's quite a few of those listed in here, and many of them sound very similar. But this was, a pretty normal thing. It wasn't like, the dominant tradition. There's probably been the same amount of queer people all throughout history, and just this was a point in European history where these people could get married if they wanted to, but it would eventually change. We will discuss how that happened. But today, we're going to talk about some people who had major influence on how the Christian church saw sex. Because like I've said, the church doesn't have that much influence on what's happening in people's lives yet. They can use guilt, they can use fire and brimstone to try and influence people, but they don't have that much political control yet. But the ideas that are later going to be used to control people in later centuries are going to start here. So we got to talk about them. One of them is a guy named Tertullian. That guy. He is another one of those ancient preachers. Most of the figures we talk about, they were preachers or bishops or someone in the church who would be writing their beliefs, writing letters to other places, arguing in defense of certain ideas. He was one of those that was majorly involved in all those arguments about what the church should be. And he had some thoughts about sex. He argued that nature is heterosexual, so should we be. Again, that argument about nature. He got very angry that people were ignoring the dress code in his area. He said men were tweezing their arm hair and plucking their beards. He complained that women from the upper class were dressing like the lower class. Specifically, he talks about streetwalkers, which at this point in history, the rules in the empire had changed a bit, so it was harder for upper class women to be free sexually. It was harder for them. So some women would basically sign some paperwork legally to work as prostitutes so that they had more freedom to be out and about in public and have sex. And he did not like this, and so he wrote, "Look at the streetwalkers, the shambles of popular lusts. Also at the frictices, and if it is better to withdraw your eyes from such shameful spectacles of publicly slaughtered chastity, yet but do look with eyes askance, and you will at once see them to be matrons." What's fascinating is, he says, look at the frictrices. Frictrices, one of those old words we talked about, frictrix, is a ancient Latin word for lesbian. This means that there were publicly recognizable same-sex couples out and about that could just felt free and safe enough to walk hand in hand. Enough that a preacher could see them on the street and be angry about it, and his only recourse is to write about it. Not to arrest them, not to punish them, to write about how, society has come to this today. There are lesbians in the streets. It's fascinating. That means that they were somehow visually recognizable, either holding hands, they had a style of dress, who knows? That's just fascinating, isn't it? Clearly he is, not a fan of, but I think it's great that in his writing you see proof that we existed, always have. A more important figure we gotta talk about is a guy named Saint Jerome. Saint Jerome. At this point, we're going to see developed further the cult of chastity, the virginity cult we've mentioned a couple times. The idea that, kind of coming from the fact that Mary was a virgin, according to tradition. The early writers who all were writing about how chastity and not getting married was better because the apocalypse is coming. Well, now the apocalypse isn't coming, but chastity is the ultimate good is just hardwired into Christianity at this point, and writers of this era are going to take it further. Saint Jerome is the most ridiculous of this class. He wrote to one noble woman who was talking to him about these issues, "Learn from me a holy arrogance. Know that you are better than they are." Because she wasn't having sex. Wild. He had students, mostly upper class. Like, a lot of these people writing and preaching are gonna be upper class people, because that's who can learn to read and write. And he had people that he taught that, this is how to be a good Christian. You don't have sex, you abstain from food and drink, you fast, you don't, enjoy nothing. And one of his students starved to death. He killed her. He left Rome at that point, because that's what you do when you have a terrible scandal that leads to you murdering a student, and he went to the Holy Land and continued his terrible death cult. Don't know why he was allowed to do that. He was a major influence on the cult of virginity, the idea that the best thing to be is chaste forever, and then you die. He was not a virgin, which he hated. He hated that fact. He wrote about it all the time. He spent 2 years in the desert running away from his sexual thoughts. He really hated the body. You can tell from his writing, and it influences a lot of later writers, where you're going to see there's this hatred for the physical form that comes to be in some Christianity. It's just a shame. It really is a shame. Now we're going to talk a bit about somebody we've already mentioned quite a few times, Clement of Alexandria, but I wanted to mention him again because I read some more stuff where he also talks about some Christians that are doing things he doesn't approve of, which is proof that people have always been queer. He wrote about how female marriage was unnatural, and he called for strict gender differentiation in physical appearance. That men must display their greater physical similarity to Christ by wearing beards. All men must be bearded. Just to remind us all, like, Christ had a beard, obviously, so we must all. Oh, man. He wrote about his concern that lesbian marriage, male homosexuality, and prostitution had become so popular in the cities. That's very concerning for him. These people, where has society gone? He writes about how, again, he writes that animals are heterosexual always, but specifically, there are two animals that at the time they knew this was not true about. They knew about rabbits and they knew about hyenas, both of whom are very different. I think the rabbit, they would say, oh, well, the Bible says don't eat rabbit, and that's because it's a gay animal. They didn't really come up with an example for, like, an explanation for why the hyena is that way, like, contrary to nature. And so the hyena ended up becoming a symbol of homosexuality at the time. He uses two terms, allelobasia, entering into one another, in terms of same-sex sexuality, and arenomixia, which is male mixing, so like a term for homosexuality. Just a few more, like, ancient terms for what, sex and sex differentiations are. Again, another writer that proves we've always been around, because he was complaining, complaining about us. I just love that. Great. All right. Now we're going to go to some less fun stuff and talk about somebody that's going to change Christianity forever in a really sad way. he's a mixed bag, this guy, St. Augustine, who is a fantastic writer and teacher and a great speaker. I feel like it'd be great to hear him speak the way that he writes, but he's a very troubled man, and unfortunately gonna have some ideas that just really hurt society and people. The reason his ideas kind of come to be important and to work well with the government of the time have something to do with the question of government. Do people need government, or can they rule themselves? Early Christians, you think about, they were minority groups who had started from this guy that wanted to overthrow the government, and so their answer probably really would have been, no, government is also evil. The government that at the time was the Romans, who were still pagan, and in their minds, the pagan gods were demons, so government was evil at this point. Well, now Constantine's converted, the government is Christian, so the relationship between the Christian faith and government's going to have to change. How is it going to change? Well, there's some arguments and some fighting at this time, and of course, the one that the government's going to go with is the one that supports their rule, their right to rule, the one that makes it seem as if God endowed the Roman government with the right to rule. And St. Augustine's going to have that answer, kind of by accident. Not really what he was seeking, I think, but what kind of came as a result of his ideas. Specifically, the idea of original sin. You've probably heard the term. I'm very curious how many of you really know what it is and where it came from. It is not something that's innate to Christianity. It did not come from Jesus or from his era. It came here around the 4th, 5th century with Augustine. He was a very troubled man. He had a mother who was very heavily Christian, incredibly Christian. His father was not, really didn't care that much. And growing up, Augustine didn't care that much either. I mean, he was a Christian, but he wasn't really that much of a practicing Christian. He was not baptized. He kind of had questions. He followed a few different groups for a while. One of them was the Manichaeans, who had a lot of heretical ideas at the time. But he didn't really agree with everything they believed, but he didn't agree with the Catholic Church, so he was looking for a version of God that made more sense to him, and he hadn't found any. He was upper class, educated, going to school, and eventually became a teacher of doctrine and rhetoric. So basically kind of like a professor who teaches upper class Romans, because that's who'd be going to these schools, how to speak and how to give speeches and how to present information, that kind of thing. And he earned a pretty decent living at it, I'm pretty sure. He had a mistress for about a decade. They were not married, but they were living together and having sex. She eventually had a son, and something. Don't remember his name. He just really enjoyed sex a lot, had problems with how much he liked it. He had a lot of close friends, but they all were kind of, they were all kind of depressed. All upper class. They have all these restrictions and kind of expectations put on them for the fact that they're going to marry and they're going to have these high-paying jobs and they're supposed to be working in the imperial court. The goal should be to serve the emperor, and none of them really feel validated or fulfilled by this. He loses a very, very good male friend at one point, his closest friend, and it just destroys him. And he feels like God took him from him as a punishment. And this is something he writes about later that we'll discuss why he thinks it a punishment. And he's never happy. He's 30 years old. He eventually comes to the point where he just is not happy. He recognizes he's not happy, and he realizes he comes to Jesus, basically. There's a long, long line of history of why he eventually does that is covered in his Confessions, which are lovely to read, honestly. Fucked up and lovely. Where he decides, okay, I'm going to be baptized, I'm going to leave government, I'm going to leave my job, I want to go and just give my life to the Lord. Because he was depressed. He hated his job, he hated his life, he only found happiness really in, fleeting relationships that, because of the society he lived in, could never really be real relationships, either his friendships with his male compatriots, his sex relationship with this woman he wasn't supposed to marry. He even had a marriage lined up for him when he converted and finally did not get married to this woman. And so he becomes a preacher and a teacher, and the revelations he goes through to understand his experience of life and the way that he felt things were is what leads to the creation of the idea of original sin. He was very concerned with the fact that it seemed like even good people and the seemingly innocent suffer. Everybody suffers, and he couldn't reconcile the fact that life seemed to suck so bad, and yet, presumably not everyone out there is constantly sinning all the time. So why does it suck? He had questions about the fact that, we want to do certain things, we want to feel certain things, but we don't have complete control over our instincts. What he talks about how free will isn't really a real thing because we can't make choices for ourselves completely independently. If you read what he's talking about, what he really is saying is we have instincts. We have subconscious desires and thoughts and feelings that we can't fully control. And the fact that we can't control them irked him. He did not like that. He would, even after converting, would continue to have dreams about sex, and he would lament the fact that he continued to have these dreams, that he wanted things, he couldn't turn off desire. And so he had to come up with an answer for why his mind was always fighting him and why even good people suffer. And his answer was that all life is corrupt. Every single one of us is born broken. Before I continue to explain, I'm just going to give you warning for fuck-uppedness. Here's how this man thinks. Hear me, God. Alas for man's sin. So says man, and you pity him, for you made him, but you did not make sin in him. Who can recall to me the sin I did in my infancy? For in thy sight no one is clean of sin, not even the infant whose life is but one day upon the earth. Who can recall these sins to me? Surely this is done by every little child I see, since in him I can see what I do not remember in myself. What then was my sin? Was it that I cried for more as I hung upon the breast? If I were to do this now, I should very rightly be laughed at and blamed. Even in my infancy, therefore, I was doing something that deserved blame. But because I could not understand anyone who blamed me, custom and reason did not allow me to be blamed. For as we grow up, we root out and get rid of such childish ways. And certainly I have never seen anyone knowingly throw away what is good when he is clearing the ground. But can we say that, just for the time being, even such things as these were good, to attempt by crying to get what would do one harm if it was given, to get into a bad temper when people who are responsible and who are one's elders do not do exactly as one wants, to get angry even with one's own parents, and with many others too who were wiser than oneself when they failed to give in to one's least whims, to strike out and do one's best to hurt when one commands which, if they had been obeyed, would have done one harm, were not obeyed. It is clear indeed that infants are harmless because of physical weakness, not because of any innocence of mind. He's saying that because babies cry and get mad and scream and have emotions and can't communicate with people, they are wicked. They are sinful because of the way they behave. That from the moment we're born, we are sinful. We are innately evil. And he looks at an infant and he sees proof of that. He sees proof of that in everything. And what he says is the origin of this evil, the origin of this sin is sex. Because sex is evil. You cannot control wanting it. You cannot turn off the desire for it. And it has no benefit. And it is our punishment from God because Adam and Eve broke the rules and they were kicked out of the garden. So now they have to have sex to procreate. Because of that, all sex is completely just evil. All sex is bad. And our breaking those rules back then led to the entirety of the world being changed, to the fact that every life is corrupt. And so we are all guilty, even when we're doing good. We are all guilty, no matter whether we're committing sins or not. And so that immediately you can see that lays the ground for a lot of things that are going to serve people in power well. If everyone is corrupt, then the government chosen by God has to control us to make sure that, all of us evil people aren't doing evil things all the time. It's only the threat of punishment from the government and from God that keeps us from being the evil that we really are. You see how that, that idea is just a seed that's going to grow into more and more controlling methods of church and God and the government. The idea that we are all innately evil, and it's only through punishment and through strict control that we can be anything else. It's horrifying. But it makes sense. Reading his confessions, you can see why he thinks this way, because his life sucks. And he's miserable for years. And it really comes from a place of he is so wealthy and so trapped in this political and cultural sphere that he's in that he just hates his life. And the answer for him must be, all life is bad, not, working in the government with the emperor is bad. It just, that's the leap he makes. He says, sin dwells in me because I was a son of Adam. He argues that obedience is better, that it is better to be submissive. Man has been naturally so created that it is advantageous for him to be submissive, but disastrous for him to follow his own will. Obviously, a government's going to love that idea. He believes that suffering and death were not natural parts of life. They didn't exist before. When Adam betrayed God and broke the rules, that's when suffering and death existed. Otherwise, life would have been perfect. He also believes the original sin is an actual thing transmitted through semen. Which is why Jesus does not have original sin. He was born without semen. That's how that works. A man by his very nature is ashamed of sexual desire, he says. And he believes Christ did not have a libido, did not have sex. And so he says, even human government that is tyrannical is preferable to no government because it is a defense against forces that sin has unleashed in human nature. And of course, he also believed that women were weaker, that they need to be controlled because Eve is what led Adam to disaster, and so that's why God gave the husband authority over his wife. It's really unfortunate. But those ideas are what is going to lead to, I just think, all the more negative parts of Christianity. The authoritative control, the don't question, just obey, sex is evil, women are weak. Like, all those ideas are baked into original sin. And it all came from just a very tormented, very sad man. I'm going to read you a little bit more about his very sad man life. I panted for honors, for money, for marriage, and you were laughing at me. I found bitterness and difficulty in following these desires, and your graciousness to me was shown in the way you would not allow me to find anything sweet which was not you. Look into my heart, Lord, for it was you who willed me to remember all this and to confess it to you. And let my soul cling to you now that you have freed it from that gripping birdlime of death. How unhappy it was then! And you pricked its wound on the quick, so that it might leave everything else and turn to you, who are above all things, and without whom all things would be nothing, so that it might turn to you and be cured. I was unhappy indeed, and you made me really see my unhappiness. It was on a day when I was preparing a speech to be delivered in praise of the emperor. There would be a lot of lies in the speech, and they would be applauded by those who knew they were lies. My heart was all wrought up with the worry of it all and was boiling in a kind of fever of melting thoughts. I was going along on the streets of Milan when I noticed a poor beggar. He was fairly drunk, I suppose, and was laughing and enjoying himself. It was a sight which depressed me, and I spoke to the friends who were with me about all the sorrows which had come to us because of our own madness. I thought of how I was toiling away, spurred on by my desires and dragging after me the load of my unhappiness, and making it all the heavier by dragging it. And it seemed to me that the goal of this and all such endeavors was simply to reach a state of happiness that was free from care. The beggar had reached the state before us, and we, perhaps, might never reach it at all. With the few pennies he'd managed to beg, he'd actually obtained what I, by so many painful turns and such devious ways, was struggling to reach, namely the joy of a temporary happiness. Yeah. It's very clear that the man was very, very sad. He found a way out of his sorrow and found an answer that explained why his life sucked so bad. And he wrote it very eloquently and very passionately. And unfortunately, people were going to take that and take it to its natural end, which was controlling, dominating, and guilting people into obedience, which he saw as a better way to live. Probably because the world he was in just showed a lot of the worst of people. He was in upper-class Roman society. So he wasn't seeing the best of the world. And I can see where it's likely he really thought many of his fellows would have been better off if they'd been more obedient. Unfortunately, that is not how his works are going to be used. You think about today, I'm pretty sure all those upper-class political people who would have been in his sphere back in the day are doing just as many horrible things as they've always wanted to do, and using the idea of original sin to control everybody else, unfortunately. Yeah, this guy is very depressing. It's very sad. Now, this is his confessions. He has other writings that I have not read, but there's a portion of his book where he just goes into, like, metaphysical, higher level kind of Christian thinking that's really fascinating and actually mirrors a lot of things Buddhism says about the idea of existence and metaphysics. It's fascinating. So, like, I have a hard time hating the guy because he's a great writer. He has some really interesting thoughts, and he's also miserable as a fuck. Like, God. And I wonder, he's definitely a person, I think, that craved relationships and never found a satisfying one because he only ever saw women as sexual beings, and he only ever saw men as friends, and he couldn't have a relationship with an equal that was sexual and fulfilling and also intellectually fulfilling, and I think that would have been great for him if he could have had that, and I don't think he ever did. And he did have this one friend that, like, if you read about how freaking sad he was, how it ruined his life almost that this guy died, it makes me wonder, how tight were you with this friend? But I don't ever think he was actually, like some of our other historical figures, a secret homosexual or what have. I don't think he ever would have done that because he's so hard on himself, because he sees all this stuff as sinful. But I think it's entirely possible if he'd been able to not see his sexuality as something so terrible, if he could have been in a healthier relationship, it would have been a lot better for him. But yeah, Lopsel puts it well, politicians used his illness to make an entire religion ill. That's exactly how it is. If you think about, there's a lot of people that influenced Christianity, but none more so than St. Augustine and his, ideas of human nature and gender and sexuality just completely changed the game and made it so much worse. Like I've said, it's not going to have that big an influence in this era, but in the 1200s when things start to take a dark turn, it will. It will. Unfortunately. So poor fellow. Hopefully he is better off now and not still so miserable, I guess. But let's continue with something that's less depressing and super cool. We're going to talk about some famous paired saints. We talked about how marriage is not really the purview of the church just yet. It's not really under their control. It's declared a sacrament in 1215 in the Catholic Church. In the Eastern Orthodox, it was a public function, like the 8th century. And it was, to this point, unions for men and women were still a done thing in various parts of the world. And we have a historical record of these marriages happening. It was not until much later that Christianity was going to step in and kind of take the reins of the political and legal part. But up to this point, lots of people still getting married. And one aspect of the marriage was the focus on, kind of Christian examples of same-sex partnership, which in this case would have been the paired saints, who aren't necessarily canonically seen as there's a lot of, and they were good friends, like brothers, where in the ancient world they probably were not interpreted that way, and in fact are likely borrowed possibly from more pagan, overt sexuality. We'll talk about it. Now, this is David and Jonathan, who we've mentioned in the past, are figures from the Bible. Talked about them in a major way in a previous episode, so we're not going to talk about them much. But they were one of those pairs of paired saints that were often seen as, like, examples of same-sex partnership. And when I read that whole little thing, that marriage thing, it mentioned two pairs of paired saints. When it was talking, those names that they gave, Philip and Bartholomew, Sergei and Bacchus, are both two same-sex paired saints mentioned right in the marriage rites of this same-sex couple. So these people were like, a way for old ancient same-sex folks to imagine for themselves a life for them in the Christian world. These saints were kind of their, superstars back then. We talked about Perpetua and Felicitas in the past, so we won't mention them much either, but they were another pair of paired saints who were seen as kind of together in a sense. They were also portrayed as being incredibly manly because they died in the arena and they died kind of fighting. Like, there's kind of an aspect to them that was sort of masculine gendered in some traditions of their stories. Now let's talk about some new folks. This is Polysut, it's a hard word to say, Polysut and Nearchos. They were Roman soldiers back in the times of, shortly after Jesus' death, I believe. So this would have been back when it was still kind of dangerous to be a Christian. How much of these stories are actually true stories, and how much is folktale? I don't know. The more important aspect of this is these were stories that were told amongst the community and gave ancient queer people stories to identify with. They were considered brothers not by birth but by affection, the closest possible friendship being both comrades and fellow soldiers, bound by a friendship which was stronger than blood or relationship, from which passionate union their souls were tightly bound together, each believing that he lived and breathed wholly in another's body. Nearchos was a Christian. Polysut was not. They were both soldiers, and they were working in the Roman kind of imperial court, I think it was, or around there. Pagans were being promoted. Christians who were refusing to sacrifice to the emperor were being beheaded, according to the story. This led Nearchos to thinking about his faith and his fear that in the afterlife, Polysut would be separated from him, because Polysut was a pagan. And so he talked to Polysut like, I'm just so worried that you're going to be taken from me forever. And Polysut basically came back and said, even if we were separated by death, no one would be able to diminish the devotion and love we have for each other. And Nearchos comes back and says, but this, dearest, is precisely what weighs on my soul. There is something worse than the death of humans. The separation I fear might take place, for I feared I would lose you from my love and that we would lose our unity of soul. Well, the worries of Nearchos were enough to convince Polysut. He converts to the tradition and they both leave their wives. I think they are, unfortunately, eventually, being that they are saints, that tends to mean that they died tragically. I don't remember how these two died. All of these saints are basically covered in this book. I do not remember how they died, but they told each other, remember our secret pledge, we'll be together in the afterlife. And so, however their lives ended, tradition says that his conversion led to them both being able to go to heaven together. Sergei and Bacchus are another pair. They were Roman soldiers of high standing. They were close to the emperor, and they were both Christians. They were as one in their love for Christ. They were revealed by enemies to be Christians to the emperor, who then demanded they sacrifice to idols. They refused. So first, to embarrass them, they were dressed up in women's clothing and paraded through town. This was apparently a common penalty for homosexuals who were discovered at the time, according to some ancient historians. They refused still, even after that. So unfortunately, Bacchus was flogged to death. Let me see if I have... That should be Bacchus and Sergei. Sergei survived and was returned to jail, and the next day was forced to run with nails through his feet, in the shoes of his boot. They were nailed through his feet. Story goes that at the end of that day, an angel came and healed his feet, and he was able to run again the next day, and everybody was so overtaken with how wild that was, you know. No longer brother and fellow soldier, we will chant together, behold how good and how pleasant it is for brothers to abide in oneness. You have unyoked from me and gone up to heaven, leaving me alone on earth, now single without comfort. This is Sergei complaining in his prison cell, like missing his guy. Well, Bacchus appears in a vision and says, why do you grieve and mourn, brother? If I have been taken from you in body, I am still with you in the bond of union, chanting and reciting. I will run the way of thy commandments when thou shalt enlarge my heart. Hurry then yourself, brother, through beautiful and perfect confession to pursue and obtain me. When you have finished the course, for the crown of justice for me is to be with you. His reward for remaining a faithful Christian is not God, not the kingdom of heaven, not to be bros with Jesus. It's to have Bacchus. Sergei's reward for his faith will be to be reunited with his boyfriend, basically, is what it sounds like. This one's not as certainly canonical according to historians. There's some debate. Sounds canonical enough to me. The language, the way that it's written, holy cow. Brother was often used as a euphemism for same-sex relations in the past, in this era, would have been a normal thing. Wow. And as we saw here in this marriage contract, Sergei and Bacchus were recognized as being a same-sex couple in the marriage contract. They were referenced as one. So, a lot of these ancient paired saints, acted as ancient representation for these folks who were a small minority, not the norm, but not at this point heavily oppressed as far as I can see. Could be dangerous, depending on the sex act and whether or not you were caught, but for the most part, just kind of going under the radar, living their own lives, having to find their own place in the world. And I think this is one of the ways that they did that, is having these stories to share with one another. Apparently another thing they were known to do was to travel to the grave of Aeolus, who was a friend of Hercules / lover of Hercules. And apparently that was a common meeting place for ancient homosexuals, and a place where they would swear bonds and marriage and, that kind of thing. There's a lot of interesting history that shows we were around, we were kicking and having our own thing and doing our own thing, and yeah, pretty great. We will continue our timeline. Next time we're going to be up to the 1200s, and that's going to be when things change. What you're going to see is a lot of political, economical, world things just changing and leading to a darker place to live in. Black Plague, 100 Years' War, a lot of issues will start to come together and lead to a lot of general persecution. The witch hunts will start, the Inquisition's around the corner, and you'll start to see a lot of countries at this point start enacting laws to punish homosexuality. But you'll see, on the other hand, the amount of times it was actually enacted is... It still sucks, and it's still problems, but these people were still everywhere. But it's going to suck a little more than it did in the past. Because back in the past, they were pretty much everywhere, and pretty much nobody gave a shit. Well, future times is going to be a little harder. But we'll cover that. Thanks for watching. I don't know if we're going to have an episode tomorrow. Bob is kicking me in my back. Thanks, Bob. As I've said, have a lot going on at the house this week. My family's moving. I'm going to be helping with packing and moving their stuff. So schedule may be a little up in the air, but we will have at least 3 episodes this week like we have the last couple weeks. We got more to talk about. Thanks for watching, and thanks to all of our members like Daniel and Jeff. I don't know who else was. Pablo was here today. Thank you all so much for the support. Tomorrow we might do a video game instead of this. I don't know. We'll see how much energy and how tired I am. How much energy I have. God, can you tell I'm tired? Soon it will be over. Thanks again, and I will see you guys soon. Bye.